You think these people would have standards about who they let up here anymore? Whispered Elizabeth Harrison, loud enough for half the first-class cabin to hear, as she settled into her plush leather seat on Wingspan Airlines Flight 247. What happens when unchecked privilege collides with silent, unassumed power at 30,000 feet? On a routine flight from Atlanta to Washington, D.C., one of the most exclusive cabins in the sky is about to become a courtroom of public opinion. A successful black man, dressed for comfort, is about to be accused of theft by a wealthy couple who believe he doesn't belong. They will call the police determined to see him humiliated and removed. But they are about to learn a lesson that will shatter their world because the man they've targeted holds a power they cannot comprehend, and he's about to reveal it. This isn't just a story about a confrontation. It's about the moment the mask slips and the powerful are held to account. The first-class cabin of Wingspan Airlines Flight 247 to Washington, D.C. was a carefully curated bubble of tranquility. The scent of warm towels and premium coffee mingled with the hushed, expensive whispers of its occupants. The cabin crew moved with practiced efficiency, their uniforms crisp, their smiles professional. Through the large windows, the Atlanta skyline glittered in the morning sun, the city already humming with activity far below. It was a world of privilege and comfort, a small rectangle of luxury, where the fortunate few could pretend the cramped confines of economy class didn't exist. Here, champagne flowed freely, seats reclined to fully flat beds, and passengers were addressed by name. It was in every sense designed to make its occupants feel special, important, and above all, entitled to their exclusivity. Marcus Bennett knew this world well, but today he wasn't experiencing it in his usual way. Today he wasn't Senator Bennett, the junior senator from Georgia, a man whose voice commanded attention on the Senate floor. He wasn't wearing his customary tailored suit, with the American flag pin gleaming on the lapel. There was no aide trailing behind him, carrying briefing papers, no security detail scanning for threats. Today, he was just Marcus, a son flying home on short notice to see his ailing mother. His usual travel attire had been replaced by a soft gray Morehouse College hoodie, comfortable dark jeans, and a pair of well-worn Nike sneakers. His only luggage was a weathered brown leather backpack slung over one shoulder, containing his laptop, a few books, and a change of clothes. He had booked the last-minute ticket himself online, using personal funds. There was no aide, no security detail, no fanfare. He wanted it that way. Anonymity was a luxury far rarer and more valuable than legroom. He settled into seat 3B, a spacious pod with its own privacy screen, and exhaled slowly. The past week in D.C. had been a brutal session of floor debates and committee hearings. The thought of seeing his mother, even in her frail state, was a grounding force. He pulled out a worn paperback, a collection of Langston Hughes's poetry, its pages soft with use, and let the familiar words wash over him. As he read, Marcus's mind drifted back to his first year at Harvard Law School, 23 years earlier. He had been the only black student in his constitutional law class, sitting in the back row of the lecture hall, when Professor Harrington had called on him. "Mr. Bennett, since you're here on our diversity scholarship, perhaps you can enlighten us about the minority perspective on this case." The humiliation had burned through him, but instead of shrinking, he had delivered such a flawless analysis that even Harrington had been silenced. That day, Marcus had learned that his most powerful weapon wasn't outrage, it was excellence. It was a lesson that had served him well through his career as a prosecutor, and now, as a senator. His thoughts turned to his mother, Josephine. At 78, her health was failing, congestive heart failure that the doctors were struggling to manage. But her mind remained sharp as ever, her wisdom undiminished. This trip wasn't just about being a dutiful son. It was about drawing strength from the woman who had taught him to stand tall in a world that often tried to diminish him. Marcus had deliberately chosen to travel incognito today, not just for the rare peace it offered, but because he needed space to think. The Voting Rights Protection Act he was sponsoring was coming up for a crucial committee vote next week. The opposition was fierce, the negotiations delicate. Sometimes he needed to step away from being Senator Bennett to remember why Marcus Bennett had entered public service in the first place. The weight of representation was always with him. As only the third black senator in Georgia's history, he carried not just his own ambitions, but the hopes of millions who saw in him a voice for the voiceless. It was an honor, but also a burden that sometimes left him exhausted. Today, for just a few hours, he wanted to be the son his mother had raised, not the senator the world expected him to be. The quiet bubble was popped by the arrival of the passengers for seats 3C and 3D. They were a couple in their late 50s, radiating an aura of brittle inherited wealth. The man, Andrew Harrison, was clad in a crisp pink polo shirt and khaki slacks that looked like they were ironed onto his legs. His thinning silver hair was meticulously combed, and a gleaming gold watch adorned his wrist. His wife Elizabeth was a sculpture of blonde highlights, beige cashmere, and understated diamond jewelry. Her face was a mask of polite disdain, her eyes scanning the cabin, as if conducting a silent, critical audit. "Andrew, darling, could you?" Elizabeth said, gesturing to her Louis Vuitton carry-on. Her voice was thin and sharp, cutting through the cabin's hum. Andrew grunted, hefting the bag into the overhead bin with a performative strain. As he settled into his seat, his eyes fell on Marcus. It wasn't a glance. It was an assessment. His gaze lingered on Marcus's hoodie, drifted down to his jeans, and finally settled on his face with an expression that was less curiosity and more classification. Marcus had seen that look 1,000 times. It was the look that questioned his presence, his right to occupy the same space. He met Andrew's gaze for a brief second, offering a slight neutral nod, before returning to his book. The nod was not returned. What no one on the plane could see was that Andrew Harrison's prejudice had been carefully cultivated over decades. As the son of a factory owner who had lost significant market share to a black-owned competitor in the 1980s, Andrew had built his financial empire on a foundation of resentment. Each success hardened his belief that he deserved everything he had, and that those unlike him were somehow gaming the system. His bias wasn't just hate, it was his worldview, his religion, the lens through which he interpreted every interaction. Elizabeth, meanwhile, was arranging her space with frantic precision. She pulled out a silk pillow, a cashmere throw, and a small bottle of hand sanitizer, which she applied liberally. "The standards really have slipped, haven't they?" she murmured to her husband, her voice just loud enough for Marcus to hear. "I remember when flying first was an event." Andrew made a noise of agreement. "Tell me about it." "It's practically the bus now." Marcus kept his eyes on the page, the words of Hughes a silent rebuttal to the Harrisons' thinly veiled commentary. "I, too, sing America." The line resonated with a sharp, bitter irony. He was used to this, the low-grade hum of prejudice that followed him whenever he wasn't flanked by the trappings of his office. He had learned long ago that a black man's success was to some an anomaly that needed to be explained away, or failing that dismissed. "Nobody'll dare ask me to explain myself this time," Andrew muttered to his wife, just barely audible. "I've got the Westridge account signing tomorrow. $15 billion under management after that." Elizabeth preened slightly, her expression softening as she gazed at her husband. Their shared pride was palpable. In their world, the size of the accounts you managed directly correlated to your worth as a human being. It was a simple equation that had served them well. For Marcus, their conversation was merely background noise, a familiar soundtrack to the exhausting experience of existing in spaces not designed with him in mind. The flight attendants began their final preparations for takeoff. A young woman named Vanessa Wilson, her name badge gleaming, approached the Harrisons with a tray of pre-departure drinks. "Mr. and Mrs. Harrison, champagne or orange juice?" Vanessa offered her practiced smile, not quite reaching her eyes. "Champagne, of course," Elizabeth trilled, taking a flute. Andrew nodded for his. Vanessa then turned to Marcus. "Sir, anything for you?" she asked, her smile professional but weary. "Just water, please." "Thank you, Vanessa," Marcus said, making a point to use her name. He saw a flicker of surprise and appreciation in her eyes. The Harrisons watched the interaction, their faces unreadable but tight. As Vanessa walked away, Elizabeth leaned toward her husband. "He seems awfully familiar with the staff," she whispered, the insinuation hanging in the air. Marcus closed his eyes, his fingers tightening on his book. He wasn't going to let them get to him. He was just a son on his way to see his mom. That was all that mattered. Vanessa Wilson was 26, 5 years into a job she had once loved, but now increasingly doubted. She had joined Wingspan Airlines with dreams of travel and adventure, but the reality had been far different. As a flight attendant, she existed in a strange limbo, technically in a service role, but also responsible for safety and security. The contradiction often placed her in impossible positions, especially with first-class passengers who viewed her as something between a servant and an obstacle. She had learned early on that the path of least resistance was usually the safest. Passengers like the Harrisons, wealthy, entitled, connected, could make trouble for her with a single complaint. A poor performance review could cost her preferred routes or even her job. So she had developed a protective professional mask, a persona that could weather their condescension without showing the hurt or anger it caused. When Marcus had thanked her by name, using the simple courtesy so many passengers forgot, it had momentarily cracked that mask. It was a small humanity in a job that often felt dehumanizing. She would remember it later when forced to make a difficult choice. Across the aisle in seat 3A, Dr. Amara Wilson observed the subtle dynamics playing out. As a sociology professor specializing in power dynamics and racial interactions, she recognized the textbook microaggressions being displayed. Born to Jamaican immigrants who had both been professors, she had grown up watching her parents navigate predominantly white academic spaces. Her father's accent had often been mocked, his expertise questioned, despite his 3 doctoral degrees. She saw in Marcus's calm demeanor the same dignified resilience her father had embodied. Dr. Wilson had experienced her own share of prejudice in academia. As one of only 2 black women in Georgetown University's sociology department, she had published groundbreaking research on status hierarchies in public spaces, only to have white colleagues question her methodology or suggest her conclusions were too political. Her recent book, Invisible Boundaries: Race and Space in American Life, had been critically acclaimed but dismissed by some as identity politics rather than serious scholarship. This flight was supposed to be a brief respite, a trip to Atlanta for a speaking engagement at Spelman College. Instead, she found herself witnessing the very phenomena she studied playing out in real time across the aisle. She made a mental note of the Harrisons' behavior, the tone, the sidelong glances, the performative disgust. It was data for her ongoing research, but it was also painfully familiar. She had chosen her seat in first class today as a small personal rebellion, a claim to space that people like her had historically been denied. The cabin filled with the remaining passengers, a mix of business travelers in expensive suits, a well-known tech entrepreneur who kept his AirPods in to avoid conversation, and an older couple who appeared to be celebrating an anniversary judging by the 50 years pins on their lapels. The plane began to pull away from the gate, the engines humming to life. The safety demonstration played on the screens, largely ignored by the first-class passengers who had seen it countless times before. Marcus put away his book and gazed out the window as the plane taxied toward the runway. Atlanta, his home state's capital, stretched out below. He had represented these people for 6 years now, fighting for their health care, their voting rights, their dignity. And yet in moments like this, he was reminded of how quickly his own dignity could be questioned, based solely on his appearance. The plane accelerated down the runway, pressing Marcus back into his seat as they lifted into the clear blue Georgia sky. As the aircraft climbed to cruising altitude, Marcus's thoughts drifted to the journey that had brought him to the Senate. After Harvard Law, he had joined the U.S. Attorney's Office in Georgia, prosecuting corruption and civil rights violations. He had made a name for himself, taking down a county sheriff who had systematically targeted black motorists for illegal searches and seizures. That case had put him on the political map. When the Senate seat opened up after Senator Richardson's unexpected retirement, the Democratic Party had approached him. At first, he had been reluctant. The scrutiny, the fundraising, the constant public performance of politics, none of it appealed to him, but his father's words had echoed in his mind. James Bennett had been a postal worker his entire life, walking the same route in Atlanta's West End neighborhood for 30 years. Son, he had said the night before Marcus left for Harvard, never let anyone else's smallness make you small. You stand in your truth, and you'll never be lost. His father hadn't lived to see him elected, but Marcus felt his presence every time he took the Senate floor. He had won the special election by a narrow margin, then secured a full term with a more commanding victory 2 years ago. His record on criminal justice reform and economic opportunity had earned him respect across the aisle, though the current polarized climate made bipartisan cooperation increasingly difficult. The Voting Rights Protection Act was his most ambitious legislation yet. It would restore and strengthen provisions of the Voting Rights Act that had been gutted by Supreme Court decisions, ensuring access to the ballot for millions of marginalized voters. The opposition was fierce, funded by dark money groups and fueled by thinly veiled racial panic about changing demographics. Marcus knew the bill's chances were slim in the current Senate, but the fight itself mattered. Sometimes you had to plant trees whose shade you might never sit under. He returned to his Langston Hughes collection, finding comfort in the cadence of the words, "I too sing America. I am the darker brother. They send me to eat in the kitchen when company comes, but I laugh and eat well and grow strong." The poem had been a touchstone for him since childhood. Today, its words felt especially relevant as he sat in a first-class cabin where his belonging was questioned simply because of the hoodie on his back and the color of his skin. He closed the book and slipped it back into his backpack. The meal service would be starting soon, and he wanted to review his notes on his mother's medical care before they landed. Her doctors were trying a new medication regimen, and he had questions he wanted to ask when he saw her. Marcus had never been the type of politician who outsourced his personal responsibilities. His staff often joked that he was their most difficult scheduling challenge because he insisted on maintaining real connections to his life outside the Senate. He visited his mother every other weekend, mentored young law students, and still occasionally taught a seminar at Morehouse on constitutional law. It was this groundedness, this refusal to become isolated in the Washington bubble, that made him effective as a legislator. He knew what his constituents were experiencing because he remained one of them. It wasn't a political strategy. It was who he was. The seatbelt sign dinged off. Around him, the first-class cabin settled into its cruising rhythm. Laptops emerged, eye masks were donned, and the quiet hum of privilege resumed its steady beat. The plane took off smoothly, climbing above the sprawling lights of Atlanta. Once they reached cruising altitude, the ritual of the first-class meal service began. Vanessa moved efficiently through the cabin, taking orders and distributing hot towels. Elizabeth, having decided the menu wasn't to her liking, had brought her own meal, a small curated box of artisanal cheeses and gluten-free crackers. She was in the middle of arranging them on her tray table when she suddenly gasped. "My phone," she said, her voice rising in panic. "Andrew, my phone. It's gone." Andrew, who had been engrossed in the financial news on the seatback screen, turned to her. "What are you talking about, Elizabeth? It was in your purse." "I know, I had it right here," she insisted, patting down the sides of her seat. "I took it out to check my messages before we took off, and I put it in the little side pocket here. Now it's gone." Her eyes, wide with alarm, darted around before landing inevitably on Marcus. Marcus had his noise-canceling headphones on, listening to a low-volume jazz playlist as he reviewed his mother's medical notes on his tablet. He was oblivious to the brewing drama until he felt a sharp tap on his shoulder. He looked up to see Andrew Harrison looming over him, his face a mask of stern accusation. "Excuse me," Andrew said, his voice laced with authority. My wife's phone is missing. Marcus slowly removed his headphones. I'm sorry to hear that, he replied calmly. I hope you find it. It's a new iPhone 16 Pro. Rose gold. Elizabeth chimed in from her seat, her voice trembling with manufactured distress. It has everything on it. My contacts, my photos. We think you might have seen it. Andrew continued, his eyes boring into Marcus. Or perhaps picked it up by mistake. The implication was as subtle as a sledgehammer. Marcus felt a familiar cold knot tighten in his stomach, but his expression remained impassive. No, he said, his voice even. I haven't seen your wife's phone. I've been reading and reviewing my notes since we boarded. Really? Andrew scoffed, gesturing toward Marcus's simple backpack at his feet. You have a lot of things over here. It could have easily fallen into your bag. The conversation had now drawn the attention of the other passengers in the small cabin. Dr. Wilson across the aisle watched with concerned eyes. The low hum of chatter ceased. The air, once still with privilege, was now thick with tension. I can assure you it did not. Marcus said, his patience beginning to fray. He was not a suspect. He was a United States Senator, and he would not be interrogated by this pompous man. What Marcus didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that Elizabeth's phone had indeed slipped out of her purse. But it hadn't gone into his bag. It had fallen between their seats, wedged in a narrow gap just beneath the armrest divider, its rose gold edge barely visible in the cabin's dim lighting. It was precisely where Officer Thompson would find it 3 minutes later, after Marcus had revealed his identity and changed the power dynamic forever. The irony wouldn't be lost on anyone. The phone had been there all along, lost in the space between privilege and prejudice. Elizabeth began to cry soft, theatrical sobs. It was right there. I know it was. My entire life is on that phone. From row 2, a middle-aged Asian woman in a crisp business suit had been watching the scene unfold with increasing discomfort. Perhaps we could all calm down, she suggested, her voice measured. There must be a reasonable way to resolve this without escalation. Andrew shot her a look of betrayal. Stay out of this, he snapped. This isn't your concern. The woman recoiled, then looked at Marcus with an apologetic glance before retreating into silence. Later, she would recall this moment as the point where she realized that neutrality in the face of injustice was its own form of complicity. Vanessa, the flight attendant, rushed over, her face a canvas of concern. Is everything all right here? No, it is not all right, Andrew snapped, turning his glare on her. This man, he said, pointing a finger directly at Marcus, has stolen my wife's phone. The accusation, now stated so boldly, hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Vanessa looked from Andrew's furious face to Marcus's stony calm. She was young, inexperienced, and clearly intimidated. The Harrisons were loud, wealthy, and demanding the kind of passengers who wrote scathing letters to corporate if their champagne wasn't chilled to the precise degree. Marcus was a quiet man in a hoodie. In the calculus of customer service conflict, the odds were not in his favor. Sir, Vanessa said, turning to Marcus, her voice wavering. Perhaps if you could just check your bag just to be sure. To put everyone's mind at ease. Marcus looked at her, a deep sense of disappointment washing over him. He had seen the flicker of humanity in her earlier. Now, under pressure, she had folded, siding with the accuser. No, Marcus said, the word quiet but absolute. I will not be searched because this man has made a baseless accusation. I suggest your time would be better spent helping Mrs. Harrison find her phone, which is likely in her own purse or carry-on. Elizabeth let out an indignant squeak. I already looked. It's not there. He's being difficult because he knows he's guilty. Andrew puffed out his chest. That's it. I want the captain and I want the police waiting on the ground when we land. We are pressing charges. He leaned down, his face inches from Marcus's. You picked the wrong person to rob my friend. You have no idea who you're dealing with. Marcus met his furious gaze with an unnerving calm. The irony of the statement was so profound, it was almost comical. He held Andrew's stare for a long moment, the silence stretching taut. Oh, believe me, Marcus thought the words a cold, hard promise in his mind. You're the one who has no idea. Vanessa, the flight attendant, looked terrified. The situation had spiraled far beyond her training in de-escalation. "Sir, please," she pleaded, directing her words at Andrew Harrison. "Let's not involve the authorities just yet. I'm sure there's a simple explanation." Vanessa Wilson had grown up in a small town in Georgia, where her father had been the only black doctor. She had witnessed firsthand the different ways he was treated, depending on whether he was wearing his white coat or casual clothes. That unspoken understanding of the arbitrary nature of respect, how quickly it could be granted or withdrawn based on appearance, had shaped her worldview. In her 5 years at Wingspan, she had seen countless interactions where race and class collided. She had been trained to de-escalate, to find middle ground, to keep the peace at all costs. But this training often meant deferring to the loudest, most privileged voice in the room, a reality that left her feeling complicit in injustice. Looking at Marcus now, she felt a crushing sense of shame. She had defaulted to the path of least resistance to appeasing the Harrisons, rather than standing firm for what was right. It was easier to ask the accused to prove their innocence than to question the accuser's motives. But in her heart, she knew she was betraying not just this passenger, but also everything her parents had taught her about dignity and fairness. "The explanation is simple," Andrew boomed, his voice echoing in the suddenly silent cabin. "He's a thief. I want him arrested. End of story. Get the captain out here now." Vanessa scurried toward the cockpit, her face pale. The other passengers were now openly staring. Some looked uncomfortable. Others exchanged judgmental glances, their silent verdicts aligning with the Harrisons' narrative. Dr. Wilson watched Marcus intently. She saw no guilt in his posture, only a profound, weary stillness. She saw the classic ugly script of racial profiling playing out in real time. She reached for her university-issued laptop, opened a new document, and began typing discreet notes. This wasn't just an unpleasant incident. It was a case study in the weaponization of privilege. For Dr. Wilson, this moment held personal significance beyond her academic interest. Her father, Dr. Leroy Wilson, had been a brilliant mathematician whose Caribbean accent had been used as an excuse to deny him tenure at 3 universities before he finally found a home at Howard. She had grown up watching him maintain his dignity in the face of constant slights and suspicions. When he died 2 years ago, she had promised at his funeral to continue his work of documenting and challenging the invisible boundaries that constrained black excellence. Now, watching Marcus face this baseless accusation, she felt both professional outrage and personal grief. This was not just data for her research. It was a painful echo of her family's experience, a reminder that credentials and character were still insufficient shields against prejudice. Marcus slowly took a sip of his water. His mind was working furiously, not with panic, but with a cold, clear strategic precision he had honed over years as a prosecutor and then a legislator. He could escalate this now. He could whisper his title to the flight attendant and watch the entire dynamic shatter. But that would be too easy. It would resolve his immediate problem, but do nothing to address the rotten core of the issue. No, he decided he would let them play their hand. He would let them build their own gallows rope by rope. Across the aisle, Dr. Wilson continued her careful observation. She noted how Andrew Harrison stood over Marcus, using his physical position as a form of intimidation. She noted how Elizabeth's tears seemed to start and stop with suspicious control. She noted how the other passengers, mostly white and affluent, seemed either to believe the Harrisons or to wish the unpleasantness would simply go away. She had studied these dynamics for years, written papers on them, given lectures about them. But witnessing such a textbook example in real time was still jarring. It was as if the Harrisons were following a script written by generations of entitlement. See a black man in a space you consider yours. Question his presence. Accuse him of wrongdoing. Appeal to authority to remove him. In seat 4B, a young white man in his 20s shifted uncomfortably. He could see what was happening, recognized the injustice, but said nothing. Later, he would tell himself that it wasn't his place to get involved, that he didn't know all the facts, that maybe the phone really was missing. But in his heart, he would know the truth, that his silence had made him complicit. Vanessa returned with Captain Carlos Rodriguez, a stern-faced man with salt and pepper hair and a no-nonsense demeanor. He listened with a stoic expression as Andrew laid out his accusation, his voice dripping with self-importance. Elizabeth provided a tearful, dramatic backdrop. "My wife is distraught," Andrew concluded. "This man refuses to cooperate. He's clearly hiding something. As captain of this vessel, you have a responsibility for the safety and security of your passengers. I demand you have him restrained and searched." Captain Rodriguez turned his professional gaze on Marcus. "Sir, my flight attendant has informed me of the situation. My primary responsibility is to ensure the safety and smooth operation of this flight. Any disruption can have serious consequences. I would ask you, for the sake of everyone on board, to simply allow a cursory check of your belongings to resolve this." Captain Rodriguez wasn't a bad man. He was a 20-year veteran of commercial aviation who had worked his way up from regional carriers. He had witnessed countless disputes between passengers, most of them petty and easily resolved. His instinct was always to find the quickest path to de-escalation. In this case, that meant asking the accused to prove his innocence rather than requiring the accuser to substantiate their claim. It was a calculation made in the interest of operational efficiency, not justice. But in making it, he had inadvertently aligned himself with the Harrisons' prejudice. Captain Marcus said, his voice remaining level and respectful, yet unyielding. "With all due respect to your position, my answer is the same. I will not submit to a search based on prejudice. I have broken no law. I have caused no disruption. The disruption is being caused by Mr. Harrison's unfounded allegations." "Unfounded!" Elizabeth shrieked. "How dare you!" "That's it!" Andrew roared. "He's being belligerent, Captain. If you won't act, I will hold Wingspan Airlines personally responsible for any losses." He then added the ultimate threat of the entitled, "I am a multi-million-mile medallion member, and I sit on the board of 3 major corporations. My company has a multi-million-dollar corporate account with your airline. I assure you, you will hear about this." The captain's jaw tightened. The threat, crude as it was, had landed. He nodded curtly. "Fine." He said the word, clipped. He turned back toward the cockpit. "We will be radioing ahead. Law enforcement will meet the aircraft at the gate at Reagan National." Andrew Harrison smirked, a look of vindictive triumph on his face. He leaned back in his seat, crossing his arms as if the matter was settled. He had won. He looked at Marcus, his eyes conveying a clear message. "Your little act of defiance is over." For Marcus, the experience was disturbingly familiar. As both a black man and a former prosecutor, he had seen how quickly the presumption of innocence could evaporate based on nothing more than appearance and accusation. The difference was that today, unlike countless others in his position, he held a card they couldn't possibly anticipate. Vanessa retreated down the aisle, shame evident in her averted eyes. She knew she had failed a moral test, chosen expediency over justice. It was a choice she would reflect on for years to come. For the remaining hour of the flight, the cabin was thick with a poisonous silence. Vanessa avoided Marcus's aisle entirely. The Harrisons occasionally whispered to each other, casting triumphant glances his way. The other passengers maintained a studied detachment, as if by focusing intently on their screens or books, they could erase their complicity in the unfolding injustice. Marcus reopened his book of poetry, but he wasn't absorbing the words. He was preparing. He was thinking about jurisdiction, about federal law, about the statement he would make. He was no longer just a son going to see his mother. He was Senator Marcus Bennett, and a gross injustice was being perpetrated on his watch. He had a duty to see it through. For a fleeting moment, as the plane began its descent, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced since childhood. Fear. Not fear of the officers who would be waiting, but fear of what might happen if he miscalculated this moment. Would revealing his identity be seen as playing a privilege card? Would it undermine everything he'd fought for? There was a voice in his head, his father's voice telling him to stay calm, to trust in the system he'd helped build. But there was another voice, too deeper and more urgent, reminding him that sometimes the system needed to be shown its own failures to evolve. In that fraction of a second, Marcus made his decision. This wasn't about saving himself. It was about creating a moment of reckoning that might save others. As the plane began its descent over the Potomac, the familiar monuments of Washington, D.C. coming into view, the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, due to a customer service issue, we ask that you please remain in your seats after the aircraft has come to a complete stop at the gate. Please do not unbuckle your seatbelts until instructed to do so. Thank you." A murmur went through the cabin. Marcus closed his book and placed it back in his backpack. He looked out the window at the Washington Monument, a stark white needle piercing the sky. A symbol of the nation and its ideals. Ideals he fought for every day. Ideals that were at this very moment being trampled in a pressurized aluminum tube miles above the earth. He recalled a conversation with his mother from years ago when he was first considering running for office. Power isn't about controlling others. "Marcus," she had said, her hands working deftly at her knitting, "it's about standing in your truth so firmly that others can't help but see it too." The plane docked at the gate with a gentle bump. The jet bridge connected. The engines spooled down. And then there was only waiting. The silence was absolute. Andrew Harrison checked his Patek Philippe watch and huffed impatiently. Elizabeth dabbed at her eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief, maintaining her performance of distress. They both still believed they were the protagonists of this story, the wronged parties seeking justice. Across the aisle, Dr. Wilson closed her laptop. She had documented everything she had witnessed in precise academic language, not just for her research, but as a record of what had transpired. She had no way of knowing how important that record would soon become. Marcus breathed deeply, centering himself for what was to come. He had spent his career fighting for justice within the system, believing that institutions could be reformed from within. Today, that belief would be tested in a deeply personal way. The other passengers shifted restlessly in their seats. The delay was an inconvenience to their carefully scheduled lives. Most of them just wanted the unpleasantness to end, so they could continue on their way, unburdened by the moral implications of what they had witnessed. Through the window, Marcus could see two uniformed officers approaching the jet bridge. The moment of reckoning was at hand. Finally, the cabin door opened. Two uniformed officers from the Metropolitan Washington Airports Authority Police Department stepped on board. The first officer, Thompson, was a burly, middle-aged white man with a weary, cynical expression. The second officer, Ramirez, was younger, taller, and Hispanic, with a more watchful, analytical demeanor. "What's the situation?" Officer Thompson asked, his voice a gruff baritone that filled the cabin. Captain Rodriguez met them and gestured toward the third row. "This gentleman, Andrew Harrison in 3D, has accused that gentleman in 3B of stealing his wife's mobile phone." Thompson and Ramirez moved down the narrow aisle. Andrew Harrison stood up ready to perform. "Officers, thank God you're here," he began. "This man," he said, jabbing a thumb toward Marcus, "stole my wife's phone right out of her seat pocket. He's been completely uncooperative and belligerent. We want to press full charges for theft." Officer Thompson's eyes fell on Marcus. He saw the hoodie, the jeans, the backpack. Then he looked at the Harrisons in their expensive attire. His expression hardened into a familiar biased calculus. He had already made up his mind. Sir Thompson said, his tone devoid of respect, addressing Marcus. "I'm going to need you to stand up and place your hands where I can see them." Marcus remained seated. He looked calmly at the officer. "On what grounds?" Officer Thompson's face reddened. "On the grounds that you are a suspect in a theft. Now get up, or I'll add resisting an officer to the charge." "You don't have probable cause." Marcus stated, his voice quiet, but carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "You have an accusation which does not meet the legal standard required for a search or seizure of my person, especially given the context." Officer Ramirez. The younger partner shifted his weight. He was watching Marcus's eyes. He saw no fear, no guilt. He saw something else, confidence, an unnerving degree of it. "He thinks he's a lawyer," Andrew Harrison sneered. "That's enough," Sir Officer Ramirez said to Andrew, his voice firm. He then looked at Marcus. "Sir, we're trying to resolve this without causing a bigger scene. If you've done nothing wrong, a quick look in your bag will clear it all up." "The principal," Officer Marcus said, his gaze shifting to Ramirez, acknowledging his more professional tone, "is that an American citizen should not have to prove their innocence to appease a prejudiced accuser. The burden of proof is not on me." Thompson had heard enough. "All right, you're done talking," he growled, reaching for his handcuffs. "You're coming with us. Stand up now." This was the moment. The line had been crossed. Marcus held up a hand, a gesture not of surrender, but of command. "Officer Thompson," he said, his voice dropping into a lower, more powerful register, the voice he used on the Senate floor. "I would advise you to stop right now." He reached down, not with haste, but with a deliberate, almost theatrical slowness, and unzipped the front pocket of his leather backpack. The Harrisons leaned forward, their eyes gleaming with anticipation, certain he was retrieving the stolen phone. Officer Thompson tensed his hand on his service weapon. Marcus's hand emerged from the bag, but it wasn't holding a rose-gold iPhone. It was holding a dark blue leather-bound passport holder. With a flick of his thumb, he opened it. On one side was his diplomatic passport. On the other, nestled in a clear plastic window, was a gold-crested navy blue card. He held it up for the officers to see. United States Senate. Senator Marcus Bennett, Georgia. The silence in the cabin was no longer tense. It was deafening, a vacuum where all oxygen had been sucked out. Officer Thompson froze mid-reach, his eyes widening in disbelief. He blinked as if trying to clear a faulty image from his vision. He read the card again, his face, which had been flushed with aggression, drained of all color, leaving a pasty gray pallor. His jaw hung slack. Officer Ramirez let out a barely audible breath. His eyes met Marcus's, and in them was a look of dawning comprehension and utter shock. That's what he had seen. Not guilt, not arrogance. Authority. Elizabeth Harrison, who had been peering over her husband's shoulder, let out a small, strangled gasp. She put her hand to her mouth, her eyes fixed on the ID card, as if it were a venomous snake. Andrew Harrison stared, his smug expression melting away like wax, replaced by a grotesque mask of confusion, then denial, and finally sickening, gut-wrenching realization. The blood drained from his face so fast, he looked like he might faint. The man in the hoodie, the man he had called a thief, the man he had ordered the police to arrest, was a United States Senator. Dr. Wilson watched the scene unfold with a sociologist's precision. This was it, the textbook definition of a status reversal. She watched the physical manifestations of crumbling power. Officer Thompson's face draining of color. Andrew Harrison's mouth hanging agape. A faint wheezing sound escaping his lungs, as if he'd been punched in the gut. This was more than just a twist. It was a violent recalibration of the social order happening right in front of her. For Elizabeth Harrison, the ID card was not a symbol of government. It was a social nuke. The title senator registered in her mind, not as a political office, but as a tier of status so far beyond her own that it was unimaginable. They hadn't just picked on the wrong person. They had picked on a member of a different species altogether. The Hamptons, the charity galas, the country club. All of it felt like a child's sandcastle about to be washed away by a tidal wave. A strangled bird-like sound caught in her throat, a sob of pure selfish terror. And Andrew Harrison, the master of his universe, the man who moved markets and bent people to his will, simply stared. His entire worldview was predicated on a clear, simple hierarchy. He was at the top. People like the man in the hoodie were somewhere near the bottom. This hierarchy was the natural order of things. It was immutable. But the ID card in the senator's hand didn't just challenge that order. It took a sledgehammer to it, shattering it into a million pieces. The man he had profiled, insulted, and tried to have arrested wasn't just his equal. He was, in the context of federal authority and public power, vastly his superior. The smirk that had lived on his face for the last hour had not just vanished. It felt like it had been surgically carved off, leaving behind a raw, exposed mask of utter ruin. Into this vacuum of shattered reality, Marcus Bennett's voice emerged. He had let the silence do its work, let them stew in the horror of their own creation. Now it was time to pass sentence. What happened in the next few moments would be recalled differently by different witnesses. Some would remember a thunderous rebuke. Others would recall a cold, precise dismantling. In reality, Marcus's voice never rose. It simply took on a quality of absolute authority that seemed to vibrate through the very floor of the aircraft. He slowly, deliberately lowered his hand and stood up. Not because they had told him to, but because he was now in absolute control. The act of him rising to his full height was in itself a declaration of dominance. "Officer Thompson," he began, and the sound of his name made the burly officer flinch as if he'd been tasered. "Your badge number is 7341. I made a note of it when you boarded." His eyes shifted to the younger officer. "And Officer Ramirez, badge number 5082. His gaze swept between them, pinning them in place more effectively than any restraint. "You are officers of the Metropolitan Washington Airports Authority Police, a body which operates under federal jurisdiction on federal property. You responded to a call, but you failed to conduct even a preliminary investigation. You approached me with a presumption of guilt. You ignored my testimony and immediately escalated to threats of physical restraint and arrest." He took a step forward into the aisle, forcing the officers to unconsciously take a step back. "You did so without probable cause, relying solely on the word of a complainant whose accusation was transparently rooted in class-based and racial animus. This is a catastrophic failure of police procedure. It is also a flagrant violation of my Fourth Amendment rights against unreasonable searches and seizures." He paused, his eyes locked on Thompson's. "I have to wonder, officer, is this standard practice or was it just for me? Was it the hoodie or was it something else?" He didn't wait for an answer. He turned his gaze to the younger officer. "And you, Officer Ramirez, you knew this was wrong. I saw it in your eyes. You hesitated, but you did not intervene. You did not counsel your partner. You did not uphold your duty to the Constitution you swore an oath to defend. You stood by." Ramirez looked down, unable to meet the senator's gaze. "Let this be a lesson to you in the architecture of injustice," Marcus continued. "The silent bystander is a load-bearing pillar." It was at that moment, seeing no escape from the legal abyss opening before them, that Elizabeth Harrison made her move. It was a desperate, panicked gambit. "Oh, wait, just a moment," she cried out, her voice high and strained. She began to rummage frantically in her large, expensive Hermes Birkin bag, the one she had so definitively claimed to have already searched. It was a theatrical performance of the highest order. "Oh, goodness me, how utterly foolish," she muttered, pulling out a wallet, a silk scarf, a gold-plated case of mints. With all the commotion, I was just so flustered. And then, with a gasp of feigned surprise that fooled absolutely no one, she produced the rose gold iPhone. "Here it is," she exclaimed, holding it aloft like a holy relic. "Andrew, darling, look. It was in my purse the whole time. It must have slipped into the side pocket when I was getting out my sanitizer. Oh, thank heavens." She let out a nervous, tinkling laugh that sounded like breaking glass. "Well, I am just so terribly embarrassed. Senator, my deepest apologies. What a silly, dreadful mistake." She looked at Marcus, her eyes wide with a desperate plea for forgiveness, for this entire nightmare to be rewound and erased. She was offering him an off-ramp, a way to dismiss the whole thing as a simple, harmless misunderstanding. Marcus looked at the phone in her hand. He looked at her pathetic, hopeful face, and he gave her nothing. His expression remained one of cold, unimpressed granite. He let the silence stretch, forcing her to wither under the weight of her own transparent lie. A mistake, he finally said, the words falling like chips of ice. Mrs. Harrison, a mistake is forgetting your keys. What you did was deliberate. You saw my skin, not my humanity. And now you're not sorry, you're terrified. He leaned in slightly. As you should be. He turned his attention to the cockpit door, where Captain Rodriguez stood, as if frozen to the spot. Captain Marcus's voice boomed, snapping the man to attention. Yes, Senator Rodriguez stammered. Your name, please, for the record. Captain Carlos Rodriguez, sir. Captain Rodriguez. I find myself in an untenable position. I am a passenger on your aircraft, and I have been subjected to harassment and a false accusation, which your crew, specifically your flight attendant Vanessa, actively facilitated. I do not feel safe on this plane. I do not trust the judgment of your crew. Therefore, I will not be completing this journey with you. I require you to have my gate-checked luggage removed from the cargo hold and brought to the jet bridge immediately. Yes, Senator, of course. Right away, Senator. Rodriguez fumbled for his radio, his hands shaking. I am profoundly sorry for what has happened on my flight. Your sorrow is noted, Captain, but it is insufficient, Marcus stated flatly. This incident revealed a systemic failure, not just a personal one. I will be speaking with your CEO, Laura Sandoval, later today. I trust you will inform her to expect my call. I will also require the full names and employee numbers of every crew member on this flight. I suggest you begin compiling that list now. Andrew Harrison, who had been rendered speechless by the revelation of Marcus's identity, finally found his voice. It was a pale shadow of his earlier arrogance. Senator, please, this has all been a terrible misunderstanding. My wife was upset, and I was simply trying to protect her. If we could just... Marcus cut him off with a raised hand. The gesture was so authoritative that Andrew immediately fell silent. Mr. Harrison, I don't believe I asked for your input. Your actions today speak for themselves. You weaponized your privilege against me, attempted to humiliate me, and tried to use law enforcement as your personal enforcers. Now you want to minimize it because you've discovered I have the power to hold you accountable. That, sir, is not contrition. It's calculation. Andrew took a physical step back, as if the words themselves had pushed him. Dr. Wilson, who had been documenting the entire exchange, felt a surge of vicarious satisfaction. This was justice being served in real time, not through violence or revenge, but through the precise application of truth against power. Officer Thompson, his composure somewhat recovered, attempted to salvage the situation. Senator Bennett, on behalf of the MWAA Police Department, I want to extend our sincere apologies for this misunderstanding. Misunderstanding. Marcus's voice was sharp. Officer Thompson, your actions today weren't a misunderstanding. They were a clear demonstration of bias. You presumed my guilt based on appearance, escalated without cause, and threatened me with arrest without probable cause. That's not a misunderstanding. That's misconduct. Thompson's face flushed, with a mixture of shame and defensive anger. Sir, we were responding to a reported theft, and your first instinct was to threaten and intimidate rather than investigate. Ask yourself honestly, officer, would you have treated a white man in a business suit the same way? The question hung in the air unanswered because the answer was obvious to everyone present. I will be filing a formal complaint with Chief Alvarez regarding this incident, Marcus continued. I suggest you both prepare your statements accordingly. With the situation on the plane thoroughly dismantled, Marcus turned to walk toward the exit. The two officers, Thompson and Ramirez, once his accusers, now parted for him like servants. You two will wait here, Marcus commanded over his shoulder. Do not leave the aircraft until I have disembarked. I will speak with you again on the jet bridge. He grabbed his worn leather backpack, slung it over his shoulder, and walked down the aisle. He paused for a fraction of a second as he passed Dr. Wilson, giving her a brief, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement. It was a silent recognition. I saw you. Thank you. He stepped out of the aircraft and onto the jet bridge. The stale, recycled air of the plane was replaced by the cool, sterile atmosphere of the airport terminal. The transition felt symbolic, like crossing a border from a war zone back into a civilized world he was now in charge of. As promised, a ground crew member was already waiting, holding his single-checked suitcase. He pulled out his personal cell phone. He ignored the flood of notifications and dialed a number from memory, a number he could call at any hour of any day. "Michael, it's Marcus," he said. His voice was calm, but it was the calm of a general directing a battle. "I'm fine, but my travel has been disrupted. I'm at DCA. I need you to do several things for me immediately." He began to pace the length of the jet bridge, his voice low but decisive. "First, cancel my afternoon. I won't be getting to Atlanta until much later. Rebook me on the next available flight, any carrier except Wingspan Airlines. Use the emergency congressional fund. This is now official business. Second, I need you to contact the office of Chief Alvarez, head of the MWAA Police. Inform him that I will be filing a formal complaint against 2 of his officers for misconduct and a violation of my civil rights. He needs to call my cell phone within 30 minutes. Third, get me the direct office line and the home number for Laura Sandoval, the CEO of Wingspan Airlines. I'll be calling her personally." He paused, listening to his chief of staff's response. "Yes, Michael. The home number, too. She can take the call after she's put her children to bed. I find that makes an impression." He paused, looking back through the small window of the jet bridge at the police officers, who were now emerging from the plane, their heads bowed. "Also, Michael," he continued, a new steely edge to his voice, "I want you to start a file. Title it Passengers Trust and Dignity Act. I want every FAA statistic on discriminatory incidents for the past 5 years. I want a list of every civil suit filed against the major U.S. carriers for similar issues. The people who started this, they thought they were just putting a man in a hoodie in his place. They have no idea what they've actually done. They've just launched a legislative campaign." He hung up. He stood there for a moment in the quiet of the jet bridge, the muffled sounds of the busy airport, a distant hum. He thought of his mother waiting for him in Atlanta. The purpose of his journey had been love and comfort, but along the way, it had been intercepted by hate and prejudice. And in his world, a world of consequence and power, such an act could not go unanswered. The Harrisons had wanted to make an example of him. He looked toward the terminal, his jaw set. So be it. He would make an example of them. Michael Reynolds, a tall, lean man of 35, with impeccable suits and a mind like a steel trap, had been Marcus Bennett's chief of staff since his first Senate campaign. What began as a professional relationship had evolved into something closer to brotherhood. Michael had been there through every legislative battle, every media crisis, every midnight strategy session. He knew the senator not just as a politician, but as a man, his principles, his breaking points, his undying commitment to justice. So when Marcus called with that particular tone in his voice, the calm fury that only emerged when something had struck at his core values, Michael knew this was no ordinary travel disruption. He immediately put the office on high alert. "I need Jamal and Aisha on those FAA stats right now." Michael directed his legislative team. "Sarah, get Chief Alvarez on the line. Tell him it's regarding a serious incident involving 2 of his officers, and the senator expects his call within the half hour. No excuses." He dispatched his travel coordinator to find the next flight to Atlanta, while he personally handled the most sensitive task, obtaining Laura Sandoval's home phone number. This required calling in a favor from a former colleague, who now worked as a senior VP at Wingspan. The number was considered privileged information, shared only for genuine emergencies. This, Michael decided, qualified. Meanwhile, on the jet bridge, Marcus continued his systematic response. He wasn't acting out of anger, though anger would have been justified. He was acting from a place of strategic purpose. The incident on the plane hadn't just been an insult to him. It had been a symptom of a larger disease, the casual consequence-free discrimination that infected American institutions. He had spent his career fighting against this disease through legislation. Now it had personally attacked him, and he would respond by turning it into a catalyst for change. Officers Thompson and Ramirez emerged onto the jet bridge, their postures markedly different from their authoritative stance minutes earlier. Thompson looked like a man who had just discovered the ground beneath his feet was quicksand. Ramirez appeared contemplative, as if experiencing an uncomfortable moment of clarity. Officers Marcus addressed them, his voice level but unyielding. "You have my office card. I expect both of your written statements on this incident to be emailed to that address by end of day. Be thorough. Be honest. The truth will come out regardless, so it's in your best interest to be forthcoming about what transpired." Thompson cleared his throat. "Senator, I want to assure you that the MWAA Police Department does not condone." Marcus cut him off. "Save the departmental disclaimer for your statement, Officer Thompson. Your actions today spoke volumes about what is condoned in practice, if not in policy." He turned to Ramirez, whose eyes held a complexity the other officers lacked. "Officer Ramirez, I'm particularly interested in your perspective. Sometimes the view from the sidelines offers unique clarity." Ramirez nodded, understanding the subtle invitation to provide a more honest account than his senior partner might offer. As the officers departed, Marcus checked his phone to find that Michael had already arranged a seat on a Delta flight to Atlanta, departing in 2 hours. He also had a text message from Dr. Wilson's Senator Bennett. "Dr. Amara Wilson here. I witnessed the entire incident. If a statement would be helpful, please let me know." What I observed was textbook discrimination. Marcus texted back a simple, "Thank you. My office will be in touch," and saved her contact information. Independent witnesses, especially those with academic credentials, would be valuable in what was to come. He made his way through the terminal, aware of the occasional double takes from passengers who recognized him despite his casual attire. Under normal circumstances, he might have stopped for handshakes or brief conversations. Today he moved with purpose, his mind already crafting the framework of what would become the Passengers Trust and Dignity Act. By the time he reached the Delta Sky Club, where he could work in relative privacy, until his flight, Chief Alvarez had already called. The conversation was brief and one-sided. Marcus didn't yell. He didn't need to. He simply laid out the facts with prosecutorial precision, ending with a clear expectation. "I anticipate a full internal investigation, and I will be following up personally. This isn't going away, Chief." While Senator Marcus Bennett was methodically setting the gears of consequence into motion, from the sterile quiet of the jet bridge, the seeds of a more organic public reckoning were already being sown back on Flight 247. Dr. Amara Wilson, the Georgetown sociologist, remained in her seat, her mind ablaze. She hadn't just witnessed an argument. She had witnessed a living, breathing data set on power, prejudice, and social dynamics. As the other passengers began to file out hushed and wide-eyed, she pulled out her university-issued laptop connected to the airport Wi-Fi and began to type. She didn't write a mere angry post on social media. She composed a thread meticulously structured with the precision of an academic paper. Thread: a case study in real time. The weaponization of privilege at 30,000 feet. Wingspan Flight 247. The following is a witness account of events viewed through a sociological lens. Flying while black. Academic Network 125. The subjects: a white, apparently affluent couple, hereafter the accusers, and a black man, dressed casually, hereafter the accused. From the outset, the accusers established a narrative of exclusion, with audible comments on the declining standards of first class upon observing the accused. 225. She continued, her fingers flying across the keyboard. She detailed the false accusation, the theatrical panic over the phone, the immediate presumption of guilt by the flight attendant, and the aggressive certitude of Andrew Harrison. She quoted his entitled proclamations and his demands for an arrest. Then she described the senator's response, not his title, which she intentionally withheld for dramatic effect until the end. But his posture of radical calm, his refusal to perform guilt, and his precise Socratic deconstruction of the captain's and officer's logic. This wasn't just academic analysis for Dr. Wilson. In recounting the incident, she thought of her father, how his mathematical brilliance had been overlooked because of his accent, how he had maintained his dignity through decades of subtle and overt discrimination. She was fulfilling the promise she had made at his funeral, to use her platform and expertise to document and challenge these injustices. She culminated the thread with the reveal describing the senator's ID not as a weapon, but as an irrefutable counter-narrative that shattered the framework of the accuser's reality. What makes this incident particularly noteworthy is not just the status reversal, but what it reveals about the architecture of discrimination. For the crime of sitting in first class, while Black, a United States senator, was subjected to public accusation, humiliation, and threats of arrest. Consider what happens to those without his power. 24 to 25. This wasn't just an uncomfortable moment on a plane. It was a perfect crystallization of how privilege operates when it believes it's unobserved, and how quickly it crumbles when true power is revealed. The lesson: what happened today happens every day to those who lack the shield of a Senate ID. 25 to 25. She posted it, tagged 3 national political reporters. She knew respected her work and closed her laptop. She had no idea she had just lit a fuse to a powder keg. Dr. Wilson's academic credentials and precise language gave her account an immediate credibility that casual social media outrage often lacked. Within minutes, the thread was being shared by journalists, academics, civil rights activists, and ordinary citizens, stunned by the brazen nature of the discrimination. Flying. While Black began trending nationally, then came the reveal that many on social media had been waiting for a passenger from the flight posted a shaky video capturing the moment Senator Bennett revealed his identity. The footage was poor quality shot from several rows back, but the audio was clear. The gasp from Elizabeth Harrison, the stunned silence from Officer Thompson, and the senator's measured response. Major news networks picked up the story within the hour. Political reporters scrambled for comment from Senator Bennett's office, receiving only a terse statement. Senator Bennett was subjected to a baseless accusation and discriminatory treatment on Wingspan Airlines Flight 247. He is reviewing all appropriate responses to this incident. But it was Dr. Wilson's thread, with its academic framing and meticulous detail, that gave the story legs beyond a typical viral moment. She was invited onto national news programs, where she provided the same measured analysis she had offered online. Her personal connection to the issue, her father's experience as a Jamaican immigrant professor whose accent had limited his opportunities despite his brilliance, added emotional weight to her scholarly perspective. What we witnessed was not an isolated incident, she told CNN's afternoon anchor. It was the system functioning exactly as designed. The only unusual element was that for once the target had the power to fight back effectively. By mid-afternoon, the hashtag #IFlew with Senator Bennett was trending as other passengers from the flight began sharing their perspectives. Some expressed shame at their silence. Others tried to justify the Harrison suspicion. Each new account added fuel to a growing national conversation about race, class, and the spaces where they collide. For many Black Americans, the incident resonated with painful familiarity. Social media filled with their own stories of being questioned, challenged, or removed from spaces where their presence was deemed suspicious. The senator's experience wasn't unique. It was simply unique in its resolution. By the time Andrew and Elizabeth Harrison deplaned, walking through the terminal, in a zombie-like trance of shame and fear, Dr. Wilson's thread had been shared hundreds of thousands of times. The story was out, and the cascade of karma had begun. For Andrew Harrison, the deluge hit the next morning. He was in his mahogany-paneled home office, a room that had always been his fortress of solitude and power, barking into the phone at his frantic PR team. but it was like trying to patch a bursting dam with chewing gum. The story was the lead item on every major news network. His name and photo were everywhere. At 9:15 a.m., his private line rang. It was Jacob Donaldson, the famously stoic chief investment officer of the California Teachers Retirement System, Harrison Capital's largest and most important client. Andrew Jacobs said, his voice devoid of any warmth. There was no preamble. We are invoking the reputational risk clause in our limited partnership agreement. Consider this your official notice. We will be redeeming our full position effective immediately. Andrew felt the blood drain from his face. Jacob, wait. It's a misunderstanding. It's been blown completely out of proportion. You can't pull $300 million based on some Twitter gossip. It's not gossip when it's corroborated by a U.S. Senator's office. Andrew Donaldson replied coolly. My members are public school teachers. We cannot have their retirement funds managed by a man who embodies the very prejudice they teach against. The optics are untenable. The decision is final. A formal letter is on its way. The line went dead. That call was the first stone in an avalanche. Before noon, 3 more institutional investors had pulled out. By 1 p.m., an emergency virtual board meeting was convened. Andrew logged on his face a grim mask ready to fight. He was met by a grid of stony-faced men and women who just last week had been his deferential partners and friends. This is a contained event. Andrew began, his voice strained. We release a statement. We apologize. We make a donation. It was Thomas Blackwell, the board's most pragmatic member, who cut him off. Andrew, it's not contained. The fund is bleeding assets by the hour. Your name is the anchor dragging us to the bottom. Your personal conduct has become a fatal liability to our fiduciary duty. Andrew stared in disbelief. My personal conduct, I built this firm. My name is on the door, and today that is the problem. Blackwell said, his voice flat and final. The board has voted. We're exercising the termination clause in your contract. You are to resign as CEO and chairman, effective immediately. We'll draft a generous severance, but you will be out by the end of the day. Unlike in earlier scenarios, where Andrew would have been completely destroyed, the board offered him a compromise. He would retain his equity stake and a nominal role as founding partner emeritus, but would have no operational authority or client contact. It was a face-saving measure designed to minimize disruption to the firm while removing him from any position where he could cause further damage. For a man who had defined himself by power and control, even this partial demotion was devastating. Andrew Harrison, who had spent decades believing that wealth insulated him from consequences, discovered its limits in a single day. Elizabeth Harrison's downfall was quieter, but no less impactful. Her karma arrived via text messages and emails. A curt 2-sentence email from the Children's Hospital Foundation informed her that her resignation from the board had been accepted. Her friend Catherine, the organizer of her social circle, sent a text. Elizabeth, think it's best if you sit out the book club meeting this week. Things are just very tense. The ultimate blow came when she drove to her country club, desperate for a sliver of normalcy. As she walked into the grill room, the lively chatter suddenly died. People didn't glare. They simply looked away, their faces blank, as if she were a ghost. Her regular table of friends was there, but they were engrossed in a sudden intense study of their menus. She stood there for the full minute, exposed and invisible, before turning and fleeing the silence, chasing her out the door. Her social currency, built over a lifetime of carefully managed appearances, had been rendered utterly worthless. In the quiet of their home that evening, as they watched news reports about themselves, something unexpected happened. Elizabeth, staring at footage of herself frantically finding the phone, saw herself as others did for the first time, not as a victim or a socialite, but as a person willing to lie and manipulate to maintain her privilege. The recognition was painful. A crack in the carefully constructed facade she had maintained her entire adult life. Andrew, she said quietly, what we did was wrong. Her husband didn't respond immediately. When he did, His voice lacked its usual certainty. It was a mistake. No, she insisted, surprising herself with her clarity. It wasn't a mistake. We saw a black man in first class, and we decided he didn't belong. Everything after that was us trying to enforce that belief. She looked at her husband, seeing his weakness for the first time. We need to actually apologize, not for the optics, for what we did. Andrew stared at her, uncomprehending. The concept of genuine contrition was foreign to him. But in the days that followed, as their social and professional lives continued to unravel, Elizabeth would begin a painful process of self-examination that her husband was incapable of. It wouldn't restore their social standing, but it would begin a personal reckoning long overdue. In their sprawling Greenwich estate, surrounded by possessions that no longer brought joy or status, the Harrisons faced a punishment more fitting than complete destruction, the loss of their unexamined entitlement, and the beginning of accountability. The corporate and institutional fallout was just as swift. Wingspan Airlines stock was in freefall. In a packed crisis room at their Atlanta headquarters, CEO Laura Sandoval stared at a bank of screens flashing red. The hashtag boycott Wingspan was gaining traction. Every major news outlet was running the story, often with the airline's logo prominently displayed. "What's the update from DC?" she snapped at a pale-faced VP of communications. "Senator Bennett's office is refusing our calls." "Madam CEO," the VP stammered. "They said the senator will be communicating directly with you at a time of his choosing." His chief of staff also requested a full record of every discrimination complaint filed against us in the last decade. Laura Sandoval felt a chill. This wasn't a PR crisis anymore. It was a political one. Bennett wasn't just looking for an apology. He was building a case. At 48, Sandoval had worked her way up from flight attendant to the C-suite through intelligence, determination, and political savvy. She was the first Hispanic woman to lead a major U.S. carrier, and she understood the particular scrutiny that came with being a first. She also understood that her airline had just made a catastrophic error. "Get me everything on Captain Rodriguez and flight attendant Wilson," she directed. "Full personnel files, performance reviews, customer feedback. And I want our internal data on passenger complaint patterns. Specifically, I want to know if we have a systemic issue with how we handle disputes involving passengers of color." Her team exchanged nervous glances. They knew what she was really asking. Do we have a pattern that could become evidence in a Senate hearing? The preliminary findings were not encouraging. While Wingspan didn't have an explicit bias problem, their data showed troubling disparities in how complaints were handled when race was a factor. Black passengers were more likely to be the subject of security calls, more likely to be rebooked rather than accommodated, and less likely to receive compensation for disruptions. Sandoval's hand was forced. She held a press conference that afternoon, announcing the immediate suspension of Captain Rodriguez and flight attendant Vanessa, pending a full investigation. She pledged a complete overhaul of their training protocols and announced the creation of a new executive position, Chief Diversity and Customer Dignity Officer. It did little to stop the bleeding. The airline stock had dropped 12% by closing bell. Corporate accounts were threatening to take their business elsewhere. Flight bookings were down 30% for the coming week. Then came the call she had been dreading. At 9:30 p.m., just as she was about to leave the office, after a 14-hour crisis day, her direct line rang. The caller ID displayed a Washington, D.C. number she didn't recognize. Laura Sandoval speaking. "Ms. Sandoval, this is Senator Marcus Bennett." His voice was calm, measured, and utterly terrifying in its control. This was not a man calling to vent anger. This was a man calling to deliver consequences. "Senator Bennett, thank you for calling. First, let me express my deepest apologies for what occurred on our aircraft today. It was inexcusable, and we are taking immediate steps to—" "Ms. Sandoval," he interrupted. "I appreciate the sentiment, but I'm not calling to hear apologies. I'm calling to inform you of what happens next." The CEO of Wingspan Airlines, a woman who managed 85,000 employees and a fleet worth billions, felt herself shrink in her leather executive chair. Within 72 hours, my office will expect a complete accounting of every discrimination complaint filed against Wingspan in the past decade. We will require documentation of how each was handled and resolved. We will need your current training protocols for flight crews regarding bias incidents, as well as all internal communications regarding such incidents. Senator, some of that information may be proprietary, or Ms. Sandoval, let me be clear. This can happen one of two ways. You can cooperate fully and transparently with my office's inquiry, or I can issue subpoenas through the Senate Commerce Committee on which I sit. The information will be provided either way. The only question is whether your cooperation becomes part of the public record or your obstruction does. Sandoval closed her eyes briefly. We will cooperate fully, Senator. Good. Additionally, I am drafting legislation that will address the systemic issues that allowed today's incident to occur. The Passengers Trust and Dignity Act will establish federal standards for how airlines handle customer disputes with specific provisions against racial profiling. I would welcome Wingspan's public support for this legislation as a demonstration of your commitment to meaningful change. It wasn't a request. It was an elegant ultimatum. We would be happy to review the legislation and provide our support, Senator. Excellent. My office will be in touch tomorrow with specifics. Good night, Ms. Sandoval. The line went dead before she could respond. Laura Sandoval sat in her silent office, the magnitude of the situation washing over her. In a single day, her airline had managed to discriminate against one of the most powerful men in Washington. A man who now had both the motivation and the means to reshape the entire industry's approach to customer treatment and racial bias. She picked up her phone again and called her general counsel. David, assemble the full executive team. We're going to be up all night. And contact the board. We're going to need emergency approval for a significant policy overhaul. By morning, Wingspan Airlines announced a sweeping series of changes, mandatory bias training for all customer-facing staff, a new third-party auditing system for discrimination complaints, the termination, not just suspension of Captain Rodriguez and flight attendant Vanessa, and the creation of a $20 million fund for organizations promoting racial equity in transportation. The stock still dropped another 8%. Chief Miguel Alvarez of the Metropolitan Washington Airports Authority Police Department had been in law enforcement for 30 years. He had navigated political pressure, media scrutiny, and community relations crises with a blend of toughness and diplomacy that had served him well. But the call from Senator Bennett's office had left him genuinely shaken. This wasn't just another complaint about an officer's conduct. This was a United States senator with first-hand experience of biased policing by his officers, with multiple witnesses, and with the political power to turn that experience into a departmental reckoning. He didn't wait for the formal complaint to arrive. Within hours of the incident, he had personally reviewed the body camera footage from both officers. What he saw confirmed the senator's account. Officer Thompson had approached the situation with an immediate presumption of guilt, escalated without cause, and threatened arrest without establishing probable cause. Officer Ramirez had failed to intervene despite visible discomfort with his partner's conduct. Alvarez called an emergency command staff meeting. This isn't just a PR problem, he told his deputies. This is a conduct problem, a training problem, and potentially a culture problem. And we're going to address all three. He ordered an immediate internal affairs investigation, placing both officers on administrative leave. He also commissioned an independent review of the department's training protocols, specifically focusing on bias recognition and de-escalation techniques. Most significantly, he took the unusual step of reaching out directly to Senator Bennett to request a meeting. I don't want to just address this incident, he told the senator's chief of staff. I want to address the underlying issues that allowed it to happen. The meeting took place 2 days later in the senator's office. Chief Alvarez arrived alone without the usual phalanx of public affairs officers or union representatives that might have accompanied him in such a situation. It was a deliberate choice, a signal that he was approaching this as a matter of personal responsibility, not institutional defense. Senator Bennett. He began once they were seated first. Let me offer my sincere apologies for the conduct of my officers. Their actions were unacceptable and inconsistent with our departmental values. Marcus nodded but remained silent, waiting for substance beyond the expected apology. I've reviewed the body camera footage and the written statements from both officers. Alvarez continued. Officer Thompson's conduct was clearly biased and unprofessional. He will be terminated from the department effective tomorrow. Officer Ramirez's failure to intervene represents a different but equally serious problem. He will be suspended without pay for 30 days and required to complete additional training before returning to duty. That's a start, Marcus acknowledged, but it addresses the symptom, not the disease. I agree, Alvarez said, surprising the senator. That's why I'm here. I don't want to just handle this incident. I want to make structural changes to prevent future incidents. The chief outlined his plan, a comprehensive review of the department's training protocols, with input from civil rights experts and community leaders. A new accountability structure that would require officers to intervene when witnessing misconduct, and a citizen oversight committee with real authority to review complaints and recommend disciplinary action. Officer Ramirez, after his suspension, made the surprising decision to become a whistleblower, providing detailed testimony about the unofficial practices and cultural norms that had fostered bias within the department. This wasn't written policy, but it was understood practice, part of the unspoken culture of the department. The changes announced were comprehensive mandatory quarterly training on implicit bias and de-escalation techniques, a new internal affairs structure with civilian oversight, body cameras with automatic activation during all passenger interactions, and a complete rewriting of protocols for responding to disputes between travelers. What Chief Alvarez hadn't anticipated was the fierce pushback from the police union. The day after announcing Thompson's termination, he received a call from the union president, Frank Moretti, threatening legal action. You can't throw a good officer under the bus to please some politician, Moretti growled. Thompson has 17 years of service. One incident doesn't define his career. Alvarez's response was measured but firm. Frank, I reviewed the footage myself. This isn't a gray area. He violated department policy, constitutional principles, and basic human decency. If you fight this, the footage becomes public. Is that what you want? The union backed down, but the tension revealed a deeper divide within the department. Some officers viewed the changes as an overreaction. Others saw them as long overdue. This internal conflict would complicate implementation of the reforms, creating resistance that Alvarez hadn't fully anticipated. For Officers Thompson and Ramirez, the incident marked dramatic turning points in their careers and lives. Thompson, unemployable in law enforcement after his termination, eventually found work as a security consultant for private companies, a role with significantly less authority and substantially lower pay. Ramirez, after his suspension and whistleblowing, was recruited by a police reform advocacy group, where he began training officers across the country on bias recognition and intervention. The transformation of the MWAA Police Department wouldn't be quick or easy. Institutional culture rarely changes without resistance. But the incident had created both the opportunity and the political will necessary to begin the difficult work of reform. When Marcus Bennett returned to the Senate floor the following week, his colleagues noticed a new intensity in his demeanor. Always focused and strategic, he now moved with the purpose of someone who had not just intellectual understanding of an issue, but personal knowledge of its impact. He wasted no time. During the morning business portion of the Senate's day, he rose to address his colleagues. Mr. President. He began, his voice resonating with quiet authority. I rise today to speak about a journey not from one city to another, but from a presumption of guilt to a proof of innocence, a journey no citizen should be forced to take. He detailed the incident on Flight 247, not with rancor, but with the cool, analytical precision of a prosecutor laying out his case. He used the data his staff had gathered in the days since. This was not an isolated incident, he declared, his voice rising. The FAA reports a 30% increase in complaints of discriminatory treatment on commercial flights over the last 3 years. My office has reviewed dozens of lawsuits filed against airlines, including Wingspan, that tell a similar story. Stories of passengers of color, passengers with disabilities, passengers who were deemed other and treated as threats. He paused, surveying the chamber. Many of his colleagues were paying unusual attention. Some, he noted, looked uncomfortable, perhaps recognizing that their own privilege had shielded them from similar experiences. For too long, these have been dismissed as customer service issues. They are not. They are civil rights issues. He held up a thick bound document. That is why today, along with a bipartisan group of my colleagues, I am introducing S. 1864, the Passengers' Trust and Dignity Act. This bill will do 3 things. First, it will establish a federally mandated uniform standard for de-escalation and implicit bias training for all airline personnel and airport security. Second, it will create a new streamlined office within the Department of Transportation to investigate and adjudicate these complaints. And third, it will impose steep punitive fines on carriers who demonstrate a pattern of discriminatory conduct, because if an airline can charge you a fee for an extra bag, they should pay a penalty for taking your dignity. Unlike in simpler narratives, the path to passing this legislation was neither smooth nor assured. The day after his floor speech, Marcus received a call from Senator William Bradford, a powerful Republican from Texas with deep ties to the airline industry. Marcus Bradford began his Texas drawl, more pronounced than usual. "This bill of yours is causing quite a stir. My friends at American and Southwest are concerned about compliance costs and frivolous claims." With respect, William Marcus replied, "I'm more concerned about American citizens being humiliated and criminalized for the color of their skin." Now, Bradford's tone was placating. "Nobody supports discrimination, but we need a reasonable approach. How about we form a study committee? Take 6 months, really examine the issue." It was a classic delay tactic designed to let public attention fade while appearing constructive. Marcus had seen it countless times. "I appreciate the offer, William, but this legislation moves forward. The question is whether you want to be part of shaping it or simply opposing it." Bradford's voice hardened. "You're making a mistake turning this into a partisan fight. I'm not the one making it partisan. I'm making it about justice." In the days that followed, industry lobbyists swarmed Capitol Hill. The Airlines for America trade group deployed dozens of representatives to argue that the legislation would create an unworkable regulatory burden and lead to defensive customer service that would diminish the flying experience for everyone. Conservative media outlets began running segments questioning whether the incident had been exaggerated for political gain. One pundit on a national broadcast even suggested that Senator Bennett had engineered the confrontation to advance a woke agenda. These attacks only strengthened Marcus's resolve, but they also complicated the legislative path forward. He would need to build a coalition strong enough to overcome industry opposition and partisan reflexes. Senator Eleanor Hayes, a moderate Republican from Ohio, became an unexpected ally. After watching Dr. Wilson's television interviews about the incident, she requested a private meeting with Marcus. "I've never experienced what you did," she admitted candidly, "but my biracial grandchildren will grow up in this world. I want it to be better for them." She agreed to become the lead Republican co-sponsor, giving the bill crucial bipartisan credibility. With Hayes's support, a handful of other Republicans felt political cover to break ranks. The bill's prospects improved, but passage was still far from certain. The turning point came unexpectedly. During a tense committee hearing, Laura Sandoval, CEO of Wingspan Airlines, surprised everyone by endorsing the legislation without reservation. Wingspan Airlines fully supports the Passengers' Trust and Dignity Act, she testified. "This incident forced us to confront uncomfortable truths about our industry's practices. The changes we've already implemented at Wingspan have not only improved customer experience, but have also reduced incidents requiring security intervention by 40%. This is not just the right thing to do, it's good business. Her testimony undercut the industry's primary argument that the regulations would be burdensome and ineffective. Within days, other carriers began to break ranks, recognizing the shifting political winds. 3 months after the incident on Flight 247, the Passengers Trust and Dignity Act passed the Senate by a vote of 68 to 32, a narrower margin than in simpler narratives, but still a decisive victory. The House version passed 2 weeks later. President Morgan signed it into law in a Rose Garden ceremony, where Senator Bennett stood prominently at her side. For Marcus, the signing ceremony was a moment of professional triumph, tinged with personal vindication. He had transformed an ugly experience of bias into a concrete policy achievement that would protect countless travelers for years to come. It was legislation born not from abstract principle, but from lived experience, the most powerful catalyst for meaningful change. The impact of the incident and subsequent legislation extended far beyond air travel. What had begun as a confrontation in a first-class cabin had evolved into a national conversation about privilege, power, and accountability. Corporate America took note. Within weeks of the Passengers Trust and Dignity Act's passage, major hotel chains, rental car companies, and retail organizations began reviewing their own customer dispute protocols. Many discovered upon honest examination that they had no explicit safeguards against bias in these situations. The Marriott Corporation was the first to announce a comprehensive new training program for all front desk staff, security personnel, and managers specifically focused on fair and equitable conflict resolution. Hertz Enterprise and national car rental companies jointly developed a standardized protocol for handling disputes that required documentation of the factual basis for any accusation before action could be taken. Financial institutions, perhaps seeing the writing on the wall after Andrew Harrison's downfall, were particularly proactive. Major banks instituted new procedures requiring multiple verification steps before a customer could be accused of fraudulent activity, a direct response to the well-documented pattern of black customers being falsely accused when attempting to access their own accounts. The hashtag #WhatWouldYouHaveDone became a framework for discussing ethical responsibility in the face of injustice, extending far beyond the original context of the flight. Schools, churches, and community organizations used the question to stimulate conversations about moral courage and collective responsibility. Dr. Wilson's academic paper on the incident status, race, and conflict resolution in commercial settings, a case study in real time. Bias became required reading in sociology, hospitality management, and law enforcement training programs across the country. She received a significant grant to expand her research into how bias manifests in customer service settings and the effectiveness of various intervention strategies. In the Senate, Marcus's colleagues viewed him differently after the incident. Some approached him privately to share their own experiences with discrimination stories they had never felt comfortable telling in the political arena. Others, particularly more conservative colleagues, showed a new willingness to listen on matters of racial equity, having seen the undeniable evidence of bias in the Flight 247 incident. Senator James Thornton, a conservative Republican from South Carolina, who had initially opposed the legislation, approached Marcus after it passed. "I voted against your bill," he admitted, "but my granddaughter watched that video and asked me why the police were being mean to you." I couldn't give her a good answer. It was in these personal interactions, rather than the grand legislative victories, that Marcus found the most hope for lasting change. The incident had created openings for honest conversation in spaces where such dialogue had previously been impossible. 6 months after the incident, a Gallup poll found that 72% of Americans had heard of the Bennett case, and 68% believed the resulting legislation would have a positive impact on air travel. More tellingly, 54% reported that the incident had caused them to reflect on times when they had witnessed discrimination and failed to speak up, a powerful indicator that beyond policy change, the incident had sparked genuine social reflection. In this way, what began as a moment of ugly discrimination evolved into a catalyst for examination and growth, not just for the individuals directly involved, but for the broader society that had created the conditions for such an incident to occur. After the whirlwind of media attention, legislative action, and institutional reform, Marcus Bennett finally made the trip that had been interrupted that fateful day. He flew to Atlanta on Delta, not Wingspan, to visit his mother. He drove his simple rental car, not to a fancy hotel, but to the small brick ranch house in the neighborhood where he was raised. The lights were on. He found his mother, Josephine Bennett, sitting in her armchair, a photo album open on her lap. She looked up as he entered, her smile warm and knowing. The chaos of Washington felt a million miles away. "I was worried," she said softly, her voice still retaining its musical Georgian lilt, despite the oxygen tube running beneath her nose. "Michael called. He told me there was some trouble on the plane." Marcus knelt beside her chair, his senatorial armor melting away, leaving only the sun. "There was some trouble," he admitted, taking her hand. "But we're fixing it." She patted his hand, her gaze moving from his face to a picture in the album. It was a photo of a much younger Marcus, perhaps 10 years old, standing next to his late father, a proud, smiling man in a postal worker's uniform. "Your father," she said, her voice thick with memory. "He always told you, son, never let anyone else's smallness make you small." "It seems you listened." Marcus looked at the photo, then back at his mother. The noise of the past few weeks, the shouting, the apologies, the stock tickers, the gavels, all of it faded away, replaced by the gentle, steady rhythm of the old grandfather clock in the hall. The fight was not over. But here in this room, holding his mother's hand, he understood the purpose of it all. "I didn't tell you everything," he confessed. "When that man accused me, part of me wanted to tell him immediately who I was. To see the look on his face when he realized his mistake. It would have been satisfying." Josephine's eyes, wise and knowing, studied her son. "Why didn't you?" "Because it wouldn't have changed anything," Marcus said. He would have apologized to Senator Bennett while still believing that the man in the hoodie deserved his suspicion. The system would have made an exception for me while continuing to punish others who look like me but don't have my shield. His mother nodded slowly. "So instead you let him build his own gallows." Marcus looked up, surprised by her perception. "Yes. I wanted the record to be complete. His actions, the flight attendant's compliance, the captain's capitulation, the officer's bias. I wanted it all documented so it couldn't be denied or minimized." "Your father would be proud," she said simply. "Not just of what you did, but of why you did it." They sat together in comfortable silence, the photo album between them, a bridge connecting past struggles to present purpose. Marcus told her about the legislation, about the changes already taking place in airlines and other industries, about the conversations happening in classrooms and boardrooms across the country. Josephine listened occasionally, asking pointed questions that revealed her sharp mind remained undiminished by her failing body. She had been a school teacher for 40 years, shaping young minds with the same careful attention to justice and dignity that she had instilled in her son. "You know," she said after a while, "when your father and I first moved into this neighborhood, there was a man down the street, Mr. Whitaker, who didn't want us here. He made complaints to the homeowners association, claimed our yard wasn't up to standards, called the police when your father was working late in the garage." Marcus hadn't heard this story before. "What happened?" "Your father never confronted him directly. He just kept our yard immaculate, joined the homeowners board, and became the most helpful neighbor on the block. When Mr. Whitaker's wife got sick, your father mowed their lawn every week without being asked. Never said a word about it." She smiled at the memory. 2 years later, Mr. Whitaker had a heart attack. Your father was the first person at the hospital. Sat with Mrs. Whitaker all night until their children could arrive. "Did it change him?" Marcus asked. Mr. Whitaker. "Yes, it did. Not all at once, but gradually. By the time he passed away 10 years later, he and your father were friends. Real friends. He left your father his fishing tackle in his will. Marcus absorbed this story, understanding its purpose. You're saying laws matter. They set standards and create consequences. But hearts and minds, that's a different kind of work. I'm saying both are necessary, she replied. The law protects people now, while hearts and minds are still changing. Your father changed one heart. You're changing the system. Both matter. As the evening deepened into night, they talked about her health, about his upcoming legislative battles, about family memories both bitter and sweet. When she grew tired, he helped her to bed, adjusting her oxygen and making sure her medications were within reach. Before turning out the light, she took his hand one more time. Marcus, what you've done matters, but don't let this fight consume you. There's more to life than winning, even when the cause is just. He kissed her forehead. I won't, Mama. I promise. The next morning, as he prepared to return to Washington, his mother handed him an envelope. Your father wrote this before he passed. I've been waiting for the right time to give it to you. I think that time is now. Inside was a simple note written in James Bennett's precise handwriting. Son, power isn't just about what you can do. It's about what you choose not to do when you could. That restraint, that wisdom to know when to strike and when to wait, will serve you better than any title or position ever could. Stand in your truth, but remember to walk in your compassion. Love always. Dad. Marcus carefully folded the note and placed it in his wallet next to his Senate ID. Two sources of power. One public, one private, both guiding him toward the same purpose, a world where dignity was not a privilege but a right. 6 months after the incident on Flight 247, Senator Marcus Bennett stood at the podium in front of thousands of graduating students at Howard University. The historic Black university had invited him to deliver the commencement address, an honor he had accepted with profound gratitude. The May sunshine glinted off the sea of caps and gowns before him. In the front row, he could see his mother in a wheelchair oxygen tank at her side, beaming with pride. Her health had stabilized enough for this journey, one she had insisted on making despite his concerns. Marcus surveyed the crowd, young faces full of hope, determination, and the particular mix of excitement and anxiety that accompanies transitions. Many of them would soon be entering spaces where their presence might be questioned, their competence, doubted, their very belonging, challenged simply because of how they looked. He adjusted the microphone and began. Distinguished faculty, proud parents, family members, friends, and most importantly, the graduating class of 2025. It is my profound honor to stand before you today. I had a carefully prepared speech about perseverance, excellence, and service. But instead, I want to talk to you about power, not the kind that comes with a title, but the kind you carry within you wherever you go. 6 months ago, I boarded a plane dressed much like many of you might dress on a weekend, a college hoodie, jeans, sneakers. I was just a man trying to visit his mother. But to some people on that flight, I was something else entirely, a threat, a suspect, someone who didn't belong. When I was accused of theft and threatened with arrest, I had a choice. I could have immediately identified myself as a senator. That would have resolved my situation instantly. But it would have done nothing for the next person who looks like me, but doesn't carry a Senate ID. He stepped away from the podium, connecting directly with the graduates. Power isn't just about what you can do. It's about knowing when to reveal it and when to hold it close. Sometimes the most effective response to prejudice isn't outrage, but strategic patience. Each of you possesses power that cannot be taken from you. Your intellect, your character, your dignity. You will enter rooms where people underestimate you. Let them. Systems designed without you in mind. Transform them. Individuals questioning your right to exist in spaces they consider their own. Outlast them. Marcus paused, his gaze sweeping across the audience. The Passengers Trust and Dignity Act is now law. But laws alone cannot transform hearts and minds. That work belongs to all of us in our daily choices. My father was a postal worker who never held public office. But he understood that true power isn't controlling others. It's standing so firmly in your truth that others can't help but see it too. He looked at his mother, drawing strength from her presence. Class of 2025. You graduate at a pivotal moment. The challenges before us are immense. They won't be solved by titles alone, but by people who understand the true nature of power and responsibility. So as you leave, Howard, claim your power. Use it wisely. And remember that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to be diminished by someone else's smallness. Marcus gripped the edges of the podium, his voice resonating with conviction. You are not just the future, you are the present. The world doesn't need to wait for your impact, it's already feeling it. Every room you enter, you transform. Every space you occupy, you elevate. Every challenge you face, you redefine. As he concluded, the students rose in a standing ovation, but his eyes sought only one face, his mother's. Josephine Bennett sat in her wheelchair, tears streaming down her cheeks, her hands raised in silent applause. In that moment, he wasn't a senator. He was her son, fulfilling the promise his father had seen in him all those years ago. After the ceremony, as graduates and families mingled on the lawn, Marcus knelt beside his mother's wheelchair. "What did you think?" he asked softly. She took his hand, her eyes bright with pride, and something deeper, a recognition of generational purpose fulfilled. "You didn't just tell them what to do," she said. "You showed them who to be." The story of Senator Marcus Bennett isn't just about the epic downfall of the entitled. It's a powerful reminder that the fight for dignity happens everywhere in the halls of Congress and in the first-class cabin of an airplane. It shows us that true strength isn't about how loudly you can shout, but how calmly you can stand in your truth, armed with integrity. If this story moved you, please hit that like button to show your support. Share this video with others who need to witness what happens when prejudice meets its match. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories of justice and accountability. Remember, small actions can create big change, both in how we treat others and in how we respond when treated unfairly.